Thank you, Mr. Chair. Christian Griffith with the Assembly Budget Committee. For reference, I will be looking at the agenda on page 28 and 29 just to sort of walk through some key points. The Assembly plan responds to a lot of feedback that was provided by a wide range of stakeholders throughout the state. On page 28, the staff comment section summarizes broadly some feedback that we heard regarding the plan that the governor had, and sort of looking at ways to improve it, but to sort of first talk about some of the challenges with the governor's plan and with other plans that have been put forward. The first is that the multi-year funding, it's too early to block in multi-year funding because there's considerable uncertainty about the amount of cap-and-trade money we will have. So trying to move forward and decide how to divide up a pie for future years, it's very difficult to do when you don't know what the pie is. And given that the intent of this program is to be years and years, decades, to try to reduce cap and trade, to try to lock in something at this time when you only see the tip of the iceberg and not the whole iceberg is really difficult. The second piece is there wasn't enough money for local projects. We continually heard from stakeholders across the state that the $100 million for the huge swath of projects that were proposed was just not sufficient to really make the differences that people were hoping when they saw SB 375. And the other thing is that some of the projects on the list, it was a very narrow list. There were other kinds of projects, for example, transit passes that people saw a lot of potential in, and it seemed like that needed to be broadened. The third thing was that the state projects were sort of essentially put in the budget and kind of had an earmark, whereas the local projects had to go through a pretty rigorous competitive grant process and demonstrate their cap and trade, their emissions reductions, and have a lot of evaluation. And it seemed like, given that the intent of the program is to reduce carbon, that all projects should be evaluated vis-a-vis each other, because essentially as we fine-tune this program going forward, we're trying to, the goal of it is to reduce carbon and reduce greenhouse gases, and to do that, we really need to holistically weigh things we're doing at the state level versus what locals are doing. Another comment that came forward, which is very important, is that the funding for transit and metropolitan planning organizations was needed as part of this. The state has limited firepower in what it can do with state agencies to really change the greenhouse gas emissions statewide on its own, and these partners are really important to have a robust plan. But the challenge for trying to make find rules for these partners at this point is because the fuels part of AB 32 has not yet come online, it's hard to know what proportion of funding should go to which activity. And the other thing that we really can't tell now is how the AB 32 fees will have, what any distortional effect they'll have on fuel prices, which would mean impacts on potentially the gas tax revenue we generate right now, impacts on transit ridership, all kinds of externalities could happen from this fuels feed when it goes online, and it kind of depends on how it impacts the economy as a whole. So trying to set that up a year before we know the facts is very, very difficult, and so a year-to-year funding level gives us some certainty so we go into next year and we're able to sort of look at where things really are. And then finally, there was a lot of criticism about the California environmental screen. The screen recently was updated to reflect new data at the census tract level. At the top 10% level, there's only 3 census tracts in the entire Bay Area that are seen as disadvantaged, and that doesn't really part of the challenge is trying to do a one-size-fits-all screen for the whole state has some real limitations because there's real differences in cost of living and other things that it didn't really account for. So that was one of the pieces of criticism that we're seeing. So the Assembly plan was attempting to try to build on the governor's plan, which had some really good elements to it, and then respond to some of these criticisms that I outlined on page 28. And so page 29 shows you kind of the approach, which is very simple, frankly. It's to have, as the chair articulated, as you articulated, Mr. Chair, the state reduction activities in a competitive pot that would be administered by the Strategic Growth Council, and then local reduction activities in the Sustainable Communities grants that would also be administered by the same entity. And essentially, there would be 2 different pots to try to compete, and basically the goal would be that both pots have similar criteria. I mean, obviously they have to work a little differently because they're different intergovernmental relations and things, but there's similar criteria, and we're thinking the same way, and we're holding the same standards for both pots. The other 2 elements on the plan, if you look at the chart, the low-emission vehicle rebates would be the same as the governor's proposal, and the legislature's already acted on the $40 million water use efficiency piece as part of the drought package, so those are maintained. Finally, the high-speed rail in the governor's plan gets a third of the money ongoing, and that was really necessary in some ways because of the need for the project to have some certainty in funding at this point. As it looks towards going to operations, it needs to figure out the right funding mechanism to kind of take the next step in construction. And so that seemed to be the rationale for why a dedicated funding source would be needed for that at this point. But since we really don't know how much funding that is at this point, it could be a third of $4 billion, it could be a third of $700 million. It really is kind of a backwards way to finance a huge construction project. So this proposal would essentially give the authority for some lines of credit for the administration to look at trying to figure out a funding package that they could bring forward to get to the initial operating construction level, which is about, that's basically to get into the LA basin, and then come back and then so that we can consider that as part of the overall cap and trade plan, as opposed to sort of putting aside a third of an unknown revenue source and then hoping that's enough money and not being sure. It could be too much, it could be too little. And that way it's a more thoughtful sort of way to be prudent about the funding and look at all the funding at one time.
Thank you for that presentation. Are there any questions? I imagine the LAO has comments, and then the Department of Finance.
Thank you, Brian Brown, LAO. With this being a new proposal, we don't have a formal recommendation at this point. We'll continue to work with staff as this goes to conference committee, as I assume it will. Just two kind of high-level considerations for committee members as this does move forward. One is with respect to the revenue assumptions. The Assembly plan does have a modestly higher revenue assumption as part of its plan, and that may well materialize. I would just note that the administration hasn't done a multi-year revenue projection. I think that's some of the uncertainty that your staff alluded to in his presentation. This does raise one question that actually hasn't come up too much in prior discussions about even the governor's cap and trade proposal, which is if revenues don't materialize at the level expected, is there a prioritization of projects? How will, if there are less funding than projects appropriated for, how would those projects be prioritized? So that may just be something to think about as you develop your plan moving forward. And then with respect to the expenditures, certainly it's a matter of legislative priority, how you want to put these money forward for what kinds of programs. I think in part, as your staff explained, part of this in response to an issue that we identified in reviewing the governor's plan, which is a lack of clarity as to what each of the individual components of the governor's plan, what level of emission reductions would be achieved, that there hadn't been that level of analysis done. So I think it's probably worthwhile to think about alternative approaches to identifying and the most effective projects. In that vein, though, I think it is important to make sure that the legislature's priorities are encompassed in whatever enabling legislation is put forward, to make sure that that the Strategic Growth Council, or whichever administrating agency is used, ultimately, that agency uses criteria that meets your legislative priorities and goals for this program. So that'll be an important part of the legislation as it moves forward and as you work on developing it.
Thank you.
Good morning, Matt Almy, Department of Finance. We also just received this Assembly cap and trade plan late yesterday and have not had an opportunity to comprehensively review the proposal. However, we do have a few initial reactions. First, in terms of the revenue assumptions, as stated, there is a lot of unpredictability with the auction proceeds. And for that reason, the administration believes that using a revenue assumption of slightly over $1 billion in 14-15 is not fiscally prudent. Because of the significant amount of uncertainty regarding cap and trade auction proceeds, which was underscored by the most recent May 16th auction that generated $71 million of revenue to the state, it's more appropriate to use a conservative revenue estimate. Second, on high-speed rail. We are supportive of the clear legislative intent to provide a financing mechanism to advance the high-speed rail project. However, despite this clear intention, because the proposal is one-time, the Assembly plan would not provide a dedicated ongoing funding source for the project. Without a dedicated ongoing commitment of cap-and-trade funds for high-speed rail, there would not be funds available to repay this $20 billion federal RIF loan or to repay a $20 billion lease revenue bond, which would create a significant future general fund cost pressure. Furthermore, the administration is uncertain at this time if lease revenue bonds could be used to provide financing for this project. Traditionally, lease revenue bonds are used to finance leasable assets, such as the construction or renovation of office buildings, versus a transportation corridor project. And then lastly, Cal EnviroScreen. The agenda includes a statement that the Cal EnviroScreen is flawed. In fact, Cal EnviroScreen is a science-based screening tool that relatively ranks areas of the state based on pollution burden and vulnerability to that population. It matches criteria set forth in SB 535 to identify disadvantaged communities and was developed through a rigorous and extensive public process. Furthermore, the agenda is factually inaccurate in the statement that there were only 3 census tracts identified as disadvantaged in the entire Bay Area. In fact, Cal EnviroScreen identifies 45 census tracts in the 9-county Bay Area region that fall within the 20% highest scoring disadvantaged communities. We understand there's going to be additional discussion on the cap-and-trade expenditure plan in the coming weeks, and we look forward to future negotiations.
Thank you. I know there's some public comment on this item. If those of you who are interested in giving public comment could stand up so I can get a sense of what we should do for time limits. Okay, well, is that everybody? Give or take? All right. Don't the rest of you all stand up now. 2 minutes each, please. Yes. Ms. Skinner, we will go with you first. My apologies. I knew you wanted to speak.
No worries. I may want to comment after public comment also, but...
so you shall.
Just quickly, because the last comment you made was on the EnviroScreen. The 10 census tracts, which we asserted, or the 20, was based on the 10%, and your 45 is using the 20%. So that we really weren't in contradiction. It was just what percentage point that was being used. And I raise it because, for example, in my district alone, Oakland and Richmond and San Pablo, 3 communities that have, if we take any set of criteria regarding income, regarding failed school rates or schools with the most, in the most dire need, highest, say, beneficiary of local control funding formula, you know, on and on and on, all the types of things that the EnviroScreen is designed to, in effect, capture. Unemployment rates, you know, a whole host of indicators, and yet census tracts in those 3 communities, there is I mean, it's like not even there. So they would not be the beneficiaries if we were to utilize that screen as is. And exactly why, I don't understand, but there's clearly a flaw if it doesn't address that.
Ms. Skinner, Arsenio Mataka, Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice at Cal EPA. I want to maybe clear up a few things that may lead to this. When we released the update on Cal EnviroScreen moving to census tract, and all this information is available online, we printed in our maps and on that and online a comparison between the top 10% zip codes, which was originally proposed under Cal EnviroScreen 1.0, and Cal EnviroScreen 2.0, which looks at the top 20% of census tracts. The reason why we use those 2 figures is because both represent roughly around 20% of the population in the state of California. So we thought that was a fair comparison to look at a previous version on zip codes versus a new version under census tracts. You are correct. If you look at the top 10%, some of the Bay Area does fall out. But if you were to look at the 20%, as Matt Alme just explained, there are roughly 45 census tracts within the area. primarily many of which are, in your district of Richmond and San Pablo, as well as a lot in San Jose and picking up East Palo Alto and Northeast Bay. So it is a statewide screen. We agree that there could be discussion surrounding a regional scan to sort of identify different priority areas, but that was the original intent of CalEnviroScreen, and as Matt Almy mentioned, it is based on the requirements set forth in SB 535, which asks Cal EPA to identify disadvantaged communities based on public health, socioeconomic factors, and environmental hazard criteria. Those are, in fact, the indicators in which we've included in this tool and present as disadvantaged communities.
Well, perhaps we can have the opportunity to talk offline before conference committee starts, but
Okay.
it is, I think, a very legitimate concern if areas in, for example, and certainly Ms. Campos may want to look how the screen affects San Jose, but certainly if little to no areas in Richmond, San Pablo, or Oakland get included by how the screen is designed, I would assert again that the screen is flawed. So we can sit down and look at it and see if I'm incorrect, which I'm happy to be proven to be incorrect, because all of my real concern is that those neighborhoods, like many in San Jose, Bayview, Hunters Point in San Francisco, Oakland, San Pablo, and Richmond in the East Bay, and there's a number of other communities in the East Bay that probably fall into this. I don't want to be trying to be inclusive here or exclude some that may, but I certainly would need to sit down and look, because in our running of it, it did not appear so. But let me go now to the other issues of cap and trade. I want to thank the Assembly staff for their work on this, because I feel that what the staff has done in the construction of this proposal, and clearly there was member input, but what I wanted to raise is that, for example, if we take the governor's proposal for many of the state activities that the administration had in mind, the way the Assembly has constructed it, it does not exclude those activities. Potentially. I mean, some may fall off, but it does not exclude them. It basically just allows for a process where the state's activities go through the same type of review and screening that local projects would have to go through. That way, we can be assured, we, meaning the legislature, the public, whoever, can be assured that we are or at least through our evaluation, we have some confidence that the activities that we would use the cap and trade monies for do achieve the goals for which we know we statutorily and otherwise need to achieve. So I think the plan is very good that way, because rather than us being the arbiter, oh, this activity has a higher GHG reduction or a higher benefit under X criteria, rather than us being the arbitrator of that, we have created these pots to allow then an entity to evaluate. Now, similar to LAO's comments, as we go forward, I would want to be assured that the Strategic Growth Council actually has the capacity to do that, because I personally am very concerned that we do our best to ensure that the activities that we are funding do bring about a result in greenhouse gas emissions. And there are agreed upon, or I never use the word universal, but rather there's some protocols for this kind of quantification that are pretty standardized. And we'd want to make sure that we were utilizing such standardized protocols and not just making a sort of leap of faith that activity X or Y might bring about greenhouse gas emissions, so a reduction. So I would, and we'll have to think about how the trailer bill is written if this is what we, close down on, to make sure that the Strategic Growth Council or whatever other entity we use has the capacity, is equipped, and has the capacity to do that proper evaluation, because we would definitely want it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that within the state's plan for example, improvements to state buildings, any improvement, any I shouldn't say any, but smart efficiency upgrades in both water use and energy use have a payback. So in most cases, other than our use of Prop 39 funds for our K through 12 schools and our community colleges, we have been moving to making investments in that kind of activity through revolving loan funds so that we can reinvest and reinvest and reinvest. That way, we get at many more square foot of buildings or facilities. And obviously, the state, if we look at state facilities as kind of in a broad way, because obviously they're, say CSU and UC can be considered state facilities, if we have the ability to invest in those type of upgrades and return back the payback on the upgrade and then reinvest, that is a very wise use of cap and trade or other monies. And it was the viewpoint or the use of the cap and trade monies for example, building upgrades wasn't put in that context in the governor's plan. But this allows both the administration and the Strategic Growth Council, if they ultimately play this role, to play with that and conceptualize it perhaps differently so that we are able to use those cap and trade funds, some portion of them, again and again and again, to bring about reductions and improvements in our buildings. Finally, on the local community grants, the increase, I think, is very wise because we have this huge untapped carbon reduction potential that our cities and counties are in the midst of. If we take Riverside, for example, and most people don't think of, if you think of an area that's really engaged in what I call climate action plans, one might not think, Riverside might not first come to their mind, and yet Riverside has one of the most robust, I think they call them regional energy networks, and most robust program around what we call PACE, which is engaging with private sector building owners to upgrade their buildings, for example, and lots of other activities. And the ability for these local communities that already have programs in place, and we have over 100 California cities, for example, that have climate action plans and that have GHG reduction targets and have existing programs that would bring, that we know with some assistance would bring us a return on GHG emissions reduction. So I think the enlarging of the pot for local grants is very wise because it helps us utilize or direct funds towards existing programs that we know have a return on their investment. And when I mean return here, I'm not necessarily meaning the dollar return as much as I'm meaning the GHG emissions reduction return. And I may have other comments later, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll take public comment now. I'm not sure who's first. You guys work it out.
Hello, my name is Dan Jacobson with Environment California. I'm here today speaking with for the Charge Ahead campaign, which is made up of environmental justice, public health, and environmental groups. We agree with the staff proposal to fully fund the administration's proposal on the low-emission vehicle rebates. We just want to make sure that the subcommittee is aware that this category includes another of important low-carbon transportation programs in addition to the rebates, and that we support the full proposal by the administration because it's important to demonstrate cleaner freight technologies, to develop zero-emission vehicle trucks and buses, and to really start programs in some of the most disadvantaged communities around the state. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Josh Pana on behalf of the California Refuse Recycling Council, 125 refuse and recycling companies throughout the state. I guess I have more of a question. I'm trying to understand the proposal of the committee. We have been very supportive of the administration putting $30 million into the CalRecycle program to get organics out of the landfills because we know that has a direct connection reducing greenhouse gases. So is the committee's proposal to eliminate that and then put it in the local grants? Is that what your proposal is?
We're going to keep a list of questions and issues that come up during public comment, and I'll ask Mr. Griffith to.
Okay, so that's one of our questions. We're trying to understand it so we can gauge whether we should be supporting it or opposing it.
Should be supporting it.
Well,
now,
we
proceed.
We we appreciate that. We think that
Mr. Griffith didn't need to answer that question.
We appreciate. We think there may be potential that our 30 million could grow because we know that it could be up to 100 million that program could use. So is that a potential as well? That if there were enough programs, shovel-ready programs, because there are shovel-ready programs to do just this aspect to reduce that greenhouse gas out of the landfills. So is there, I'm not sure who's taking notes, is there well, I see the main guy is, so is there that potential, I guess, Mr. Chairman, is what I'm asking. So our folks may say, yeah, if it's beyond 30 million, if the potential is 100 million, because there's that many shovel-ready programs ready and willing, could reduce the greenhouse gas, that would be another question. And then if I understand the proposal correctly, then the Strategic Growth Council would actually make the decisions on all of these? So that's my third question. I don't know if somebody got that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll ask Mr. Griffith to answer that question also about the Strategic Growth Council in the context of the interplay between local agencies and decision makers and the Strategic Growth Council, and how local agencies will be worked into the planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Matt Robinson today on behalf of the California Transit Association. We're a member of the Transportation Coalition for Livable Communities. We've been up here a few times this year already advocating for a certain approach to the distribution of dollars for sustainable community strategies. I just want to thank the Assembly for recognizing that there should be more funding in order to do some good statewide. That being said, we still would like to see these monies go out to the regional agencies for distribution, while leaving a role for the Strategic Growth Council to essentially set up guidelines and performance measurements, et cetera. We'd also like to continue to work with the Assembly on refining the list of eligible projects to include things like transit operations, complete streets, et cetera. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Bill Higgins with California Association of Councils of Governments, which includes all 18 metropolitan planning organizations that are responsible for SB 375 implementation. Would echo the previous speaker's comments, and I would just add that we have the staff capacity, because what we do right now is we administrate federal and state programs. We have the staff capacity to score projects, and if we're looking at a Strategic Growth Council as $800 million to deal with next year, we have some staff capacity that can help distribute that money quickly, efficiently, and within the first year. And there's no shortage of really good projects that we can invest it in that reduce greenhouse gases. Thank you for your time.
Gentlemen, you were before the phone. You want to go ahead? Okay. Good morning. Connie Galippi with the California Urban Forest Council. We just wanted to acknowledge the staff's recommendation for including urban forestry in your new proposal, but we do stand firm in our support for the administration's proposal. And no concerns with the Strategic Growth Council. However, we do just raise the issue of if the legislature is looking for ways for these programs to be evaluated, that is still being left up to now the Strategic Growth Council. So it's still unknown how the projects would be evaluated and how they would be chosen with the new proposal. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Jason Ryan with the League of California Cities. We appreciate the Assembly's continued effort to invest in infrastructure and local government programs. Certainly appreciate some of Member Skinner's comments about the need to increase that pot for local governments. As you indicated, I mean, we play a key role in lowering those GHGs. So we're certainly pleased to participate and look forward to working on this. I think the proposal overall does provide some level of detail, but I think we have a number of questions, and we certainly need additional detail, and look forward to seeing that as this moves forward. Particularly as it relates to some of the waste diversion funds that were mentioned a little while earlier, and then also the inclusion of complete streets. We certainly would like to see that included. So the clarity is important. And one last final thought. As much as we appreciate this increased funding in year one, we would like to see continued long-term funding, and we think that is incredibly important with particular reference to infrastructure projects. There needs to be a certain level of certainty about that funding since they're going to occur over a number of years, so we would like to see that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee. Kiana Bess on behalf of the California State Association of Counties. Also been before you a number of times in the past years. We've talked about this, so in the interest of time, let me align my comments as part of the Transportation Coalition for Livable Communities with California Transit Association and CalCog, as well as the League. And then on behalf of CSAC, in terms of the local government coalition, very supportive of the comments by Assemblymember Skinner, and thank you for the recognition of the potential at the local level for very significant and quick GHG reductions. Thank you.
Good morning. Christina Lockie with the California Special Districts Association. And I just want to align my comments with those of my colleagues from the Local Government Coalition, and thank you for your proposal. I do want to note that a grant program for local governments that crosses multiple sectors beyond SB 375 planning would both encourage collaboration with other local entities and community organizations, and also promote projects that have multiple other co-benefits that might not be as feasible if local entities had to apply to multiple state agencies, which each have their own unique parameters and timelines. So again, I want to thank you for your proposal, and I look forward to working with you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Carla Saporto with the Green Lighting Institute. I just had two quick areas I wanted to address today. First, on the Charge Ahead campaign, which has been named the Low Emission Vehicle Rebates Program in the proposal. We agree with the staff proposal to fully fund the administration's proposal. We do want to ensure that it will continue to capture the other low-carbon transportation programs, including cleaner freight technologies, developing zero-emission trucks and buses, and also start electric vehicle car share and van pool pilots in disadvantaged communities. My second point is on SB 535. We also want to thank the committee for increasing the spending and ensuring that the priorities identified by disadvantaged communities can be funded. We do ask the committee to clarify how it will meet the goals of SB 535, which we did co-sponsor, and we would like to see the committee start to continue to use the Cal Enviroscreen to direct funds to our state's poorest and most polluted areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Pablo Garza with the Nature Conservancy. And just at the outset, I think we've supported the basic framework of the governor's budget proposal, and we think he did a good job of outlining, taking a conservative approach and outlining expenditures that we had a high degree of confidence would result in GHG reductions, particularly in the natural resource sector. With this proposal, we just saw it last night, and I think we need to see a lot more detail. I mean, there's some positive things that in the description, but I guess we're not sure if we support or oppose it at this point. We'd like to see kind of actual language. On the positive side, I think we are supportive of creating flexibility in the expenditure of these funds, because I think as science evolves, as priorities shift, I think we need to maintain that flexibility and not try and lock in this funding year after year after year in 2014-15. So I think that's a positive. We also appreciate that a lot of the natural resource investments we've advocated for are described in the description here, that, wetland restoration, forest conservation, et cetera, and so we're pleased to see that. A couple of concerns that we do have is the local pot says environmental mitigation funding. So I'd like to understand that better. I think it would be permissible to use this funding for mitigation as part of a project, but as mitigation in and of itself, I think would be really problematic if we're just using these funds for that purpose. So maybe that's addressed in the detail, but we'll reserve judgment on that piece. And then I think others have touched on this, including Assemblywoman Skinner. We like the Strategic Growth Council, and I see Executive Director Mike McCoy sitting behind me, and I think it's a great agency, but I believe they have 4 staff members at present, and I'm not sure how they, God bless them, but I'm not sure how they move $800 million out the door without seriously staffing up quickly, and that could take a lot of time. And so and they are part of OPR, which has about 56 staff. So, but and there's great people over there too. But they're not, in my experience, grant administrators. So I think there's a real capacity question here. Is this the right agency to move all these funds through and to get out in a timely manner? And I think it's really, again, coming back to where I started, we really want to see these funds spent on projects quickly to result in, we need to get GHG reductions. We need to garner public support for the program in the face of potential legal challenges. And so that's another question. And I'll stop there. Thanks for the time and look forward to seeing more details on the proposal.
Good morning, Chuck Mills with California Relief. Align quite a bit with Mr. Garza's comments and also Ms. Galippi previously. We did support the governor's budget, especially in relation to the urban forestry and the natural resources sector. With that said, I can't ignore that this proposal highlights urban forestry twice, so feeling a lot of love for that. Also, on behalf of California Relief, we do support the proposal of single-year appropriation. Good arguments made both by the committee and by Mr. Garza for that. On behalf of some of my coalition partners in the Sustainable Communities for All who couldn't be here today, we also recognize that the committee has incorporated a lot of other good things in here: affordable housing, active transportation for natural resources, as Mr. Garza mentioned, wetlands, forest conservation. We do think that, especially in the case of forest conservation, affordable housing, active transportation, those would be more appropriate at the state level rather than at the local level for administration. And of course, part of the platform for the governor's budget was ag conservation, which I see touched here in ag waste and carbon farming, but we would like to see ag conservation included. And finally, I just note that as this moves to conference, we do look forward to working with the committee and the legislature and seeing key legislation such as AB 1532 and SB 535 play a guiding role.